Hello and welcome to the Incinerator Art Award 2020 Symposium. My name is Jake Tracy, curator at Incinerator Gallery, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I broadcast today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to their spirits, ancestors, elders, and community members, past and present, and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Furthermore, I pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be tuning into today's conversation. As part of the Incinerator Art Award 2020, we'll be exploring 4 key themes of social justice across 4 video conversations, underscoring how art may bring about social change. In this talk, I am joined by artists Azza Zen, the Bureau for the Organization of Origins, Cyrus Tang, Desmond Ma, MJ Flamiano, and Shah Sawari, as we explore the theme, government. I have asked the artists 4 provocations. How does the notion of government inform your artwork in this award? In your opinion, what are the dangers or potential benefits of government? Who or who should constitute government and how? And then maybe we can explore the idea of community as government. Azza, perhaps we can start the conversation with yourself. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your work in the Incinerator Art Award and the engagement that your practice has with the material history of migrants, economy, and the separation between labor and land.
Yes, thank you, Jake. So good to be here today. And I want to start also by acknowledging that my practice has developed on the unceded land of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people. And as you mentioned, my work has started from the notion that human and non-human entities, materials, that as an artist I work with, have been standardized in the economic system that we live in today. And that is also in relationship, standardized in the sense that we have become derooted from where we came from. So whether me as a migrant here, coming from Lebanon and Syria, or the Bunning Pole that had its history in relationship to the tree, or the coin that has circulated and shifted its function from being a material such as the metal in land to becoming to have a function of exchange. And so not to generalize, but I find this seeing myself as in similar conditions as a non-human entity kind of prompted a process of artwork that became very much in tune with the material, and I started trying to see how something like carving wood can retrieve back, instead of seeing it as just wounding the wood, rather seeing the traces on those wood of how it would have been as a tree, or something like the clay collaborating with the clay that is in the image behind me, makes the clay a collaborator rather than a material that I am extracting an artistic value out of. Yeah.
Yeah, there's very much a livingness of material or transmutation as well in the physical installation of your work. Scale additionally really helps in assisting the viewer in navigating that space or translating that space into being potentially a participant as well in the materiality. I wanted to ask as well, as in relation to that thinking that I've just mentioned, that you've mentioned, you know, your work, you say that your work imagines an alternative socio-economic system that has to do with the combination of the materials and their dialogue.
Yeah, just to, with this question and coming back to the other questions, this relationship with land and labor. So given that we are derooted, I think rethinking in the current neoliberal system, there is a way to see resources as separate, and we kind of economists manage these resources as if they're separate entities, they're constrained and so on, instead of looking at kind of a symbiotic relation between material and human and the relationship between them. And so when I'm installing, the process of installing, I let the material guide me in the space. I respond to the space. And at the same time, I hope that the whatever I'm creating prompts the viewer or the person who's experiencing that space to think of what these materials is for them as well, rather than me dictating that relationship. And so often I find that
so I think
its property, or am I interrupting?
I think it was paused for a moment. Azar, would you like to just go back just a little bit and continue from there?
Yeah, so I was just saying that in terms of when an artist's work for a long time with materials and plays, whether in the studio or in different spaces, I think, and sees their history in a domestic space and how they've been arranged, I feel it kind of prompts, even when you're installing for an exhibition, possibilities for the material to kind of manifest its own force for the viewer to kind of engage with it. And so I do, it's always this, when I'm installing, it's always this balance between controlling what I have in mind and trying to push away from that versus letting the material themselves dictate what could be, what could their potential be, and so that the viewer interact with them in a freer way.
Yeah, I see that. I understand that. It's sort of allowing the autonomy of material as well for its own governance within this space, and for that exchange to occur. And that becomes a de-hierarchical, even playing field. And it allows for the sense of governmental change. So that we do we sort of dismantle that hierarchy. I want to use that note as well of like change and that transmutation from a very material idea into something that becomes a little bit more conceptually played in the Bureau for the Organization of Origins. And Ben and Peter, I wonder if you could talk a little bit further about your work in the award, which portends to a division of change. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of the work itself and broadly your practice.
Who wants to go first?
Go first, Ben.
We should have arranged that beforehand, but well, look, it is. I think you're right in suggesting it is a quite heavily conceptual work. I mean, effectively, it's a locked door as an object, and it deals with that notion of government in that it's a fictitious entity. You know, it's had a few iterations before this where, you know, there's no particular, I mean, Peter and I are representing for it now, but as a project as a whole, it's had many different artists working within it. But you you know, the notion of first of all, a bureau for the organization of origins seems so absurd and kind of Orwellian or Kafkaesque. It almost does the job itself. But the idea to have a division for change, or the change division, of course, there's that word play there where, is it like an outshoot, a satellite division, or is it about changing the way we divide things? Or, you know, there's a little bit of ambiguity there. And the ultimate relational moment is when you approach the door as the light switches on, and it appears like there's something happening beyond it, which doesn't translate so well online, unfortunately. But to discover, of course, that it's locked, despite saying please enter beneath change division, it's the door is locked. So I think that that opens up the idea of change in response to the theme of art for social change. What does that mean fundamentally? Where does change occur? Is it only in the realm of governance? Is it something that we do of our own making? Is it something, you know, I suppose it problematizes is the wrong word. Maybe it makes complex the notion of change, in that sometimes it's quite easy to say what needs changing, and, you know, certainly in relation to specific issues, we can very directly say this is not okay and it needs to change. But in a broader sense, societal change is something that's quite complex, and I think that comes back to what Azza was just saying before about the, I suppose, almost that distribution of responsibility in some way. I probably said enough.
Just going on from what you're saying, Ben, I guess also another little add-on to the work is just what you're saying about responsibility. The idea of change seems like within our work that it's behind the door, that somehow you have to get behind the door and access it. But then we've got the key in the door. So on the side of the person, of the viewer, who can actually go and potentially open the door. So it, you know, whose responsibility, or who does have access to that? It looks like it's somebody else's responsibility, but maybe it is within our hands. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer. I'm just speculating. I guess that's what our work's about.
Certainly. And as you were saying before, Ben and Peter, the idea that the two of you for this iteration are representatives for the Bureau, for the Organisation of Origins as well. And, you know, I'm really quite intrigued by the idea of collaboration, that sense of maybe removing the ego or the I from art practices and allowing it to be very collaborative with peers, and as I was saying as well, between the human and the non-human.
Yeah, well, the first iteration of the Bureau was at Blindside Gallery back in 2017, I think. Yeah. Which coincided with the Australia Day celebrations, and that had over 40 participating artists, and the inception of that was very incredibly collaborative. It started amongst a few of us in conversation, and sort of expanded out into this notion of a space where, you know, as opposed to a specific gesture, the notion of the bureaucracy is like a kind of conceptual space that work can then operate within, in a sense that, you know, in dealing with issues of Australian identity, which is what it was doing around the time of Australian Invasion Day festivities and protest, that, you know, what does it mean to be Australian? You know, who says what quintessential Australianness is, you know? And in a sense, the bureaucracy is kind of what the country is. It's a gathering of business interests that are run by bureaucracy. That's a pretty cynical way of looking at it. There's other kind of ways of considering it. So I don't want to sound too ungracious for all that we're able to achieve in this country as a result of that kind of system. But it's certainly a complex space that I don't think the contemporary discourse around identity politics is truly making sense of. I think that hopefully the various iterations of the Boo project are providing a space where, you know, the difficult questions can be teased apart and chewed on, as opposed to you know, taking a sort of ideological position, but rather, you know, it kind of opens up the space to reconceive what it means to be Australian as an opportunity, as opposed to you know, some kind of loggerheads debate over race or gender or religion or you know, Indigenous sovereignty, which of course is premium, is fundamental to the project in dealing, because a lot of its manifestations are driven by accounting for that history, which is largely, you know, not properly accounted for, we think.
I want to pick up on that point about collaboration, that sense of people coming together, the idea that there is power in the people and power in community. And maybe we can use that as a segue to Cyrus, to your work and some of the ideas that your work in the award addresses, documenting that uprise of citizens in Hong Kong, and also weaving together mythology as that allegory in your work. Cyrus, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the work itself and how it came into being, and the influence that political and historic events informs your practice.
So yeah, and normally I don't really do a lot of that kind of work, and I guess it's because the whole protest is really triggered me quite a lot, and I feel like I really want to do something. And so I think it's a lot of people might aware about the Hong Kong protest. It's based on the basic law, and which is laid down in between the British government and the Chinese government, which is they allow the Hong Kong to have a little bit more autonomy in their internal affairs. And however, and then because of the extradition bill, which is endorsed last year, and then which is trigger a lot of people, they start to worry about their autonomy and their legal system, and then it's being intervened by the Chinese government. And I lived half of my life in Hong Kong, and then I witnessed about the Tiananmen massacre. And I aware that the Chinese government is difficult for them to bend down. And then you can see about the situation, and then the hope, and how it's very dim, it's very little. But I was so amazed is the whole movement is generated by the students, and they have no power, they don't have any backup. And when the time we're thinking about money is important and any other things is important, they just simply fight for their dream. They don't even think about how dim is the hope, what is the consequence, and then they just fight for a better future, which is not about money, which is not about any other thing. It's just like something which is right. And I find out this is a very interesting, it's a kind of painful, and then in the meantime, it's really romantic and beautiful. And I just really want to capture that kind of compressed emotion. And then, yeah, in this work. And the funny thing about the wishing tree, I'm not quite sure everyone is very Asian. And so, yeah, there is a wishing tree in Hong Kong, which is where I live, and in my last 10 years before I moved to Australia. And it's really weird. And then that tree is, everyone, you just go there and then to chuck something on the top and make a wish. And then they are thinking about, it's just pray, always is pray for good luck, or they pray for a better future, or a better fortune, something like that. And everyone doing it. And the funny thing about that wishing tree, and it's because it's getting so old and actually it's dying. And so the people don't care. They keep trucking things until the tree die. And then coming out the council, they put a fake tree, and then so that to keep the spirit going. And actually, I thought, oh my God, that is a very interesting story. And then people is still going. The tree is fake, and then it's not natural anymore. And so, and that kind of spirit, and then how people is thinking about hope to project on something else. And then so that's why I asked my friend, can you go to that place to help me to photograph that tree, every single angle that I want. And then I photographed the tree, and then I print it on the glass, and then I put it in my model, and to make it like a situation. And so in regarding to the fog, I guess it's when the time I saw the whole protest, and something is really intrigued me is about they continue to use the gas weapon, and so which is I find it out. It looked beautiful in the distance, all the smoky, but actually it's really kind of sad and terrible. And all the students, they're powerless. And then I just keep thinking, how can the police do that kind of things? I just really want to capture this. So that's why, and then I put two videos together, and then to really focus about the smoke. And then you think about it's really beautiful, but actually it can be like a poison, and it can be dangerous. But I can see the beauty of the movement is the spirit, and about the awareness of the humanity, and then about the political education, and to the whole world. It's not just the Hong Kong situation anymore.
It's a very evocative work, Cyrus. And whilst we talk about the idea of sort of that poisonous atmosphere, or that danger that can exist in terms of a particular climate or time, Desmond, maybe I can turn to you to talk about your work as well, which really documents the particular spirit of a time in a very other way, where your work speaks of the racist ramifications through COVID-19. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit further about the work that you've contributed to the Incinerator Art Award, and in particular some of the materials that you've included in the artwork.
Okay, basically the title of the work is I'm Not a Virus. Basically it's about the target the Chinese, because Donald Trump went up and said this is the Chinese virus, and he made not only one time, I think 40 over times reference of that. So most people would think that Chinese in general are from China, but they never talk about the different generations and different parts from all over the world. So that has come kind of like created a division among like the Australian community. I was a little bit more fortunate because I stay in Perth, so near the city itself. So most people in my area are a little bit more educated. So if you are talking about like a working class area further away from Perth, you will probably get racial targeted, you know, like shout, like go back to Wuhan and things like that. In saying that, my daughter was a target. Okay, my daughter was named as a pet eater, and your whole family carried the Wuhan virus. So so my work is talking about the idea about the uncanny, you know, like the projection of our own ego and ideas on ordinary object. So I went to the Asian shop and an Oriental shop. I took out all things that smell like Asian, and even and I crushed the material and I mixed into my paint. So my work has that weird smell. And then also I went to the Australian environment and then collected all the eucalyptus leaves, and then I crushed them up and then mixed into the smell again. So I have that surreal feeling of like the idea that the monster, right, has meaning, has a smell. It makes that sort of personal connection when you talk about monsters, right? Because when we look at monsters, especially my undead people, you have the aesthetic look that, yeah, it's undead, it's frightening and stuff like that, but we cannot make that connection. So I realized there's this missing gap. So why don't I make my monster smell and have, so that people become more relatable to these monsters that's there.
The idea of the monster as well, when we think about fiction in literature and film, is about othering as well. And it's interesting that your monster is sort of like cloaked and camouflaged within a network of veins that really starts to say, wait a minute, if this is a particular connection from a heart or from an organ that is working in cooperation, why is it, as an analogy, that we segregate from each other and that one is the monster and the other is not?
Yeah. So the lines is some of the lines are different colors. So it could be moods, like your reaction towards the piece. And then there was like some white lines, and deliberately there's white lines because the lines is like you draw the line, you make a mark, And then my lines is actually weird because the lines itself, even though it's white, there's bubble tea bubbles inside there. So even like the purity of white is questioned, are you really white, and things like that.
Certainly. I hope one day, Desmond, that I get to encounter the work, to experience it in all of its senses, to really smell the relationships of materials between those traditional Chinese herbs and teas and incenses, and also with the eucalypts and the gums. And I really appreciate that in your work, you talk about constructing an idea of friendship during a hostile climate in particular, where the media, it can be extremely damaging.
Yes.
And maybe I'll use that idea of media as well to flow into MJ, to talk a little bit more about your work that you have contributed to the Incinerator Art Award, which speaks of the cultural ramifications and impacts of the Marcos dictatorship through your familial history, and how those complex events and use of media or silencing of media as well had that significant influence and impact on the cultural center of the Philippines. Can you talk a little bit further about that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just to give everybody like a little bit more context. So I guess my work was originally made and cited at the Cultural Center of the Philippines. So I guess the CCP, the equivalent here would probably be something like the NGV. So that big sort of cultural institution that more or less ties together the country's kind of national arts institution. And I guess for me, sort of being invited and being able to exhibit there was kind of like this like tension between all the history that I knew was behind that institution, and also I guess my role as an artist, and thinking about how I guess those things can be sort of repolished and almost rebranded. And for me, I suppose thinking about the origins of the CCP, which was essentially created by the Marcoses as like a way of, I guess, bringing the Philippines into, more or less the new century, the 20th century at the time. And thinking a lot more about, I guess, the way of using art as a way of kind of washing over or polishing, and making things beautiful in this particular way. So I suppose to me, thinking about the role of the CCP and then revisiting there as an artist was always like a complex and difficult thing. Like I think for me, going to the CCP was a bit like visiting a ghost or something, because you always sort of felt the presence of the history of that regime and the way that that regime had an effect on, of course, my family and the history of the entire country, and what would later kind of, I guess, prompt all these like mass migrancy and mass kind of like changes to the country, and, later eventually some kind of revolution.
The work itself is made up through a series of banners that are quite elongated and that are presented lined up in a row. It's also accompanied by a video that has some really interesting gestures and colors. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those, MJ.
Yeah, sure. I guess my time in the Philippines, so I spent about a month there, and so it more or less was both an exhibition and kind of like a residency. And I spent time sort of chatting to my relatives and trying to get a sense of, I guess, stories they had about the regime, like even just sort of personal things and like, I guess even funny stories as well. And for me, over time, I kind of, you know, I do sort of reflective writing about it, and I would just spend time, whether at the CCP and kind of at home, my various like accommodations. And yeah, I would kind of just talk to people about like the colors of the city, and talk to people as well about sort of the ways that I guess like an institution like that seems to be in contrast to the rest of the country. Yeah, if you've ever seen a picture of the building, it's kind of like this grand brutalist, like very geometric building, which is in complete contrast to like the chaos of Manila and like the amazing vibrancy of the colors. And I did want to kind of reflect that a little bit more in my work and kind of, I suppose, show that contrast between, you know, what is often, yeah, a sort of a difficult history to kind of sit with, I suppose.
Thank you, MJ. I think that important element of as well within your practice and this work in particular, that politics and the impacts of certain governments can cross generations, and they can inform identity well beyond their immediate impact. Whilst we talk, I would like to keep all of these ideas together, but I want to use this opportunity to pass over to Shah. And Shah, I would love to talk a little bit more about your work, Forced Leisure, that's included within this year's award. Your work talks about the movement of people, and in particular, the shameless demonstration and abuse of the Australian government that affects thousands of refugees annually. I was wondering, Shah, if you could talk a little bit more about this work and also about your time as an interpreter on Manus Island.
Sure, thank you, Jack. Yes, so the work Forced Leisure, as I said the other night, it starts from a point of contradiction, where and the work itself speaks also like to itself is contradicting the form and the material and the memory of the material with the object, the hammock, doesn't go well. So it's kind of, you know, talking to that notion of contradiction, where people that run away from persecution, where in the first world countries or countries around the world that have signed an obligation or have come together to kind of as a one human entity to give protection to those that at the first place, I'm against war, like that shouldn't be war, so that people don't, you know, run away from their countries. And then if in such situation, so that there is a law or there is a system that gives them protection and, you know, gives them the dignity, you know, that every human beings deserve. But instead, when they turn up to these places that are signatory to this promise or to the you know, United Nations Charter, they are tricked with controlled measures like law that is manipulated by, we spoke about governance, where government are selected by the people, and then when they go into the parliament, they do their own stuff. They don't care about the people. They let the people to kind of, it becomes kind of a stage or or a kind of a stage for people to watch a drama, what's going on in the, and after that, they don't have the power to do anything apart from just protesting. So when I look at this situation, sometimes, in some ways, there is no difference between me escaping the war from Afghanistan, where I was facing physical danger, and then again, if I put myself with the fellow refugees, again, I'm persecuted here too. They are persecuted, like they're, the very moment they are locked in hotels, and the government is even trying to get their telephones away from them so that they don't have even the chance to communicate with their relatives. So yeah, in 2014, 15, I was sent to, by the Department of Immigration, I got a deployment to Manus Island where I spent about 2 months doing interpreting there in the language of Hazaragi. And when I arrived there, it was a surreal, you know, experience. The very first thing that we were told that we should not, we were housed in a boat, like a big barge on a river bed, and we were told that whenever you go out of, apart from going to the detention center, if you want to go to the town center, you should inform the immigration department, because there are cannibalists here. You could, your life could be in danger. You could be eaten by the people here, and that was, it really scared us at the beginning. And then we slowly, when we ourselves investigated about it, it was a hoax. And we one day, although there was still fear among us, one day we kind of adventured out to the town center without informing the immigration. There was 3 of us, and we went and hired a boat. And this guy was so happy, like he was so kind, and he said, I will take you to my island, and then I will take you to my sister's island. And we went on a boat ride, we went and swimmed, we had some beers together. And then he said, my parents' island, my father's, my mom's island, is a bit far from here. If you come next time, I will take you there too. And then we said, okay, we will come again. So he took us, he wanted to, we said, take us back to the town center. He said, no, where do you live? He said, we live near the detention center in a boat. So he took us behind the detention center where, you know, where, I don't know if you've seen Behrouz Bouchani's video where he's sitting by the fence and singing to the sea. Mm. So we came on that side of the, so he brought us near the detention center, and and let us, you know, come off the boat. So it speaks a lot about how government is trying to create fear, like particularly the Department of Immigration, like in so many ways that you know, we as a people cannot come together to, you know, to, I don't know, to just be human. So yeah.
Shah, thank you so much for retelling that story. I really get that sense of the delivery of spirit and the spirit of humanity through open and generous exchange that is free from fear. And I think that your work really does have that juxtaposition, those contrasts that you were talking about. We have in front of us a hammock that is made out of barbed wire. It is completely impractical, and it is a situation that unfortunately here in Australia many refugees encounter. It also really eliminates identity, cultural identity, familial identity, and it therefore creates a lot of invisibility as well for many people. With that note in mind, and maybe with the other note as well of, we were talking about community. You know, communities come up a bit in some of our conversations. And I wanted to open up the floor to everyone again to maybe pick up on a couple of comments or ideas that may have been passed around between each other.
Yeah, so we were speaking about the idea of change before that, how, like, what is change, like why there is need of change, or what the change is for. And I think for me, change is like not necessarily that I want to change others. For me, change is that when I know that I'm right, or to a degree I know, not that I think that I'm right always, but when I know in my feeling that this is the right thing, and if I do not change from that position until I bring the other party to the discussion so that we start talking, then I think in some ways I can bring change, but by not changing from my position, you know. So and I think that I could say that applies to the art world, or to arts that want to bring change, is that they want to, the artists try to bring a third kind of suggestion, not necessarily a solution, but a third position, a suggestion that says that let's talk about this matter from this angle, not necessarily from the two, like, polarized, you know, angle. So for me, change is personally not to change from my position that is dear to me.
Yeah, I think I connect a lot with these ideas you are talking about, Shah. In particular, the fact that I mean, it's a social, this social contract really, on one hand, it promises free ideas and diversity, supposedly, and so on. But in many ways, the example of your experience, anything that is not valued in a particular way for the market, say workers that are migrant workers that are considered by the market valuable, they will be welcome. By the point system will be welcome. But somebody who's escaping a regime has to prove it and has to be othered, and othered physically, as in put away to become invisible, away from where the center of powers are, right? So we're not. So big part of this this process has forms, the forms of othering. It has a very clear spatial and material physicality of invisibility, where that it is, things are being pushed away and so on. And I think in many ways it relates to bureau's door, that we don't know what is out there. We'd better be in the sterilized room and imagine what is outside, but no politician is opening properly the door and trying really to make these differences. So yeah, I just had these footnotes.
It kind of brings it back to the haves and the have-nots, doesn't it? Like the racial implications are a manifestation of people / us in Australia, in a wealthy country, not wanting to devalue the stuff that we have by, you know, the whole world coming in. So there's this sort of fight between how do you regulate a world that's divided up by these basically big businesses that survive and prosper on the fact that they have divided themselves off, and they kind of co-opt other economies into this sort of system such that they can elevate themselves, you know, which again is a pretty cynical way of looking at it, but it's these are the implications, these kind of issues of well, the only way they deal with it is through fear, right? And the BOO, we call it the BOO because it's the Bureau for the Organisation of Origins, which plays off the that fear mongering that was going around at the time when it was first instantiated. Thanks to Linda Choi, one of our collaborators, came up with that title, the Boo. And that was around immigration chiefly at the time. There's this, you know, and not just that, but the, what were they called? The Apex gangs and all that kind of stuff. Like there was stuff in the media that there was these marauding gangs, you know, destroying the suburbs and all this kind of thing. And sure, there were events that prompted that, but it was completely blown out of all proportion. But I just wanted to pick up on the hope in Cyrus's tree that even when the natural thing dies, so the old spiritual nature of something that facilitates this notion of a better future, even when that dies, it sort of still is held onto by those people continuing to wish and hope for a better world. And I just think that's such a wonderful aspect of that work. In conversation too with Desmond's complexifying what it is to be white, because I don't even know what it means to be white, you know. Like if you actually dig into white history and then apply that to other countries too, what does any dominant culture, how is it defined by? You know, it doesn't matter where you go, there's always a dominant culture. So the whiteness is really, it starts to fall apart in your hands when you dig into what it even is. Like it's a myth.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And so I guess especially when you look at nowadays, the whole world is so many protests, and then one trigger to another, and then it's quite obvious, and then there is a lot of I always thinking about actually a lot of people, the normal humble people, they just want to leave, and then if they don't feel really suffocated, they will not care about a lot. This is how my family, when the time I talk to my family, and oh, what do you think about the protest? And then at the very beginning, they just don't really care a lot. But now it's getting to the point, and then even my nephew, and then she's playing the video game all the time. And then he's on the road. I was so shocked, oh my God, my nephew is getting on the street rather than playing the video game. And so I start to think about actually, most of the people, they just want to leave, but it's just getting to the point, they can't leave anymore. And then they need to do something about it. And I totally agree with Shah, and talking about the government is a very funny thing. It's like actually, it's just like a structure. And then for some reasons, no matter what kind of democracy or socialist or whatever theory behind, and then the structure is coming out run by a group of people, and then it's always become, because they're eager for the power, and then the power has become so evil. And then everyone, and then is not talking about the people what they want, and then it's just fight for their own good. And then coming out is very funny is the people, they elect the government, and then it's coming out the government is never working for the people, no matter what is the communist or the democracy. And so you look at the US is a classic example. I don't know what is the what is the idea behind the US nowadays. And so, and then we look at that situation, and then we do need to hold on to a little bit like a hope. And otherwise, I don't really know how we're going to live, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree with Hope. I mean, I have been also watching Hong Kong and also watching Lebanon. A lot of my friends are on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a failed state completely, and nevertheless they're managing to create bubbles of hope. It's just makes yourself shiver, you know, like how are they able to do that? But somehow people do self-organize, and they, maybe in those places with extreme difficult challenges, it kind of prompts people to be very spontaneous and take matters in their hands somehow. Yeah, anyway.
I think that note of action as well is really important, that you've really underscored that as that art making as an activist act, you know, like it has to be underpinned by some sort of like radical hope for change, because otherwise, as you were saying, Cyrus, apathy is dangerous.
Yeah.
Did anyone have perhaps some final thoughts to today's conversation or talk?
I really liked what I guess Shah was mentioning and kind of offering in terms of like the artist giving not another solution and not, I guess, us replicating, you know, another government, but just talking about, I guess, what is the other perspective or like interrogation or idea that I suppose the artist and the art world and like just art in general can potentially offer. And I think that's always a nice way to underpin work that does talk about kind of activism, work that does talk about politics, and then, you know, very much real people that do suffer under these systems and that probably have a lot less privilege and agency than often, you know, artists do. So yeah, I really like talking about it in those ways as well as like another offering, but not I guess a structure, a solution, but just, yeah, another potential to hope, I suppose.
I also wanted to comment on just quickly Desmond's materiality. I love this idea of mixing with the materials and having their smells. I also hope would be able to experience the work. Also, I feel like governance in many ways, from the diversity of the responses that we have here and in the whole exhibition, can come obviously from not only a big structure, but also like small gestures in domestic spaces or you were saying, MJ, that they don't need to be gigantic gestures as such. As artists, we can see and make visible those minor gestures.
Also on the idea of government, when we, like, sometimes I think that we have, as a society, different societies like around the world, we have kind of pinned our hope too much on the government. I have experienced small community movement that have changed the community totally by just not depending on any government structure or any you know, government funding, because I think when we look at the individual's power, like when they come together, and that is what the government should be like, it's the power of individuals handed to a group, that they should be they should care about the rest of the people, and provide a structure that kind of helps everyone. But if we break it to a smaller group and like try to, you know, work towards our own ideas without, you know, kind of depending on the government, that is, I think, a good way of kind of bringing change and kind of bringing valuing the value of individuals, like because I don't know, like every individual has ideas, has powers, and if we come to an agreement with each other, like, I think there's a lot of hope for the future. Maybe I'm too romantic about it.
No, I think I mean this is really something that can get us into a discussion for another hour maybe, but because I just feel like, because of my background in economics, I'm quite like, I worry also about too much individualistic like in terms of, if we think of markets, I know that's not what you are meaning, but one of the problems in the last 30 years, particularly in industrial countries, has been to undermine government role in providing services by markets' interest in keeping like complete freedom and liberty to corporations' interest and so on. So obviously there is no one single answer to this, but I think we want back government. I feel I want a role for the government, but a government that is benevolent and interested in integrating in a ways diverse point of views and without assimilation as such. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, we need we need government, but I was talking more about like how to establish values that can betterment society, like the values of care and values of empathy is kind of eroding so to kind of bring it back, I think we as a human being individually need to connect with each other instead of just waiting for the government to kind of push values from the top, like as let us say, just one example, like in the immigration department advertising, saying that never think that you can make Australia home. This to me speaks of a value projection towards outside world. Where from Afghanistan, as a Hazara, the Taliban were saying, if you have three ways, either die or accept our terms and condition or live. So under this kind of situation, where do I go? There is no hope for me, like, you know, but I have hope within. I've come across individuals that have cared so much for me as a father, as a mother in Australia, that they have directed me towards education, towards, you know, other opportunities. So for me, individual or small communities counts very much.
I think, Ashar, you've I think everyone's really underscored as well that sense of hope is something that's really needed. And perhaps there is hope further in collaboration and certainly in community, which is all-inclusive. And I think that's where we find compassion, which is what I hear a lot of people talking about when we talk about government and governance and autonomy and community. And I think that each of you are very passionate and compassionate artists. And on that note, I agree with you, Azar. We could continue for another hour on some of these topics, but I might wrap it up just for now. And we can certainly continue this at a later date, this conversation. But I would like to thank all of you. It's been such a pleasure working with each of you on with the Incinerator Art Award. And I would like to thank each of you for joining us today and for allowing us the opportunity to dive deeper into your artistic practices. I really appreciate your time, and I thank you so much for your excellent conversations surrounding government. I would also encourage, thank you. I would also encourage our viewers to visit the Incinerator Art Award website to learn more about this year's award and the artists involved. The exhibition will be running until the 1st of November. You can visit incineratorgallery.com.au to learn more. I would also encourage you to please stay tuned for the next video coming up in today's symposium.